We're just asking this one question. It's like, what do you think about companies creating human-level AI? Like, what if this gets as good as humans across the board?
I feel like their intentions with AI is not the best. It's a very useful tool, I will agree, and it can help us out with a lot of things. Like, I would assume that at this point in time, the internet would already have been able to, process information and give us answers as fast as AI apparently does, but it hasn't. So AI is a nice improvement for that, and among other things like creativity and, getting motivation, ideas, stuff like that. Just make things quick, but...
Right, so it's like you're Googling and it gives you a quick answer, and then also for like, give us new ideas for innovation.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, okay.
But unfortunately, just like everything else, like social media and the internet in general, they always keep taking their actions in the wrong direction. And so, unfortunately, AI has also suffered that same fate. So it's a bit overwhelming, it's a bit much. The expectations is way too high. And it's very, what's the word that I'm looking for? I guess it's overused, just like everything else. And it creates a, negative reaction.
A negative reaction?
Yeah.
Like what? Sorry, what do you mean?
Like, there's a lot of uses for AI that's intended for like stealing other people's content, plagiarizing, stuff like that, and it causes like major companies and districts to have to put a policy in when it comes to AI, and they have to take their time out of their day just to implement something so huge to try to downsize something that isn't really as big as it's really seemed to be. Like, again, AI it's not really flawless, so it has its problems, and that problems are unfortunately bigger than one would anticipate.
Ah, yeah, okay. And so you said it's going in the wrong direction. What do you mean by that? What's that direction?
The right direction could have been, just a simple, faster way of being able to, get what you already get from the internet, not, making that the number one thing that's going to take over everything or replace everything as it's supposedly intended to be. It's terrible.
And so when we're talking about about development, so like we could go and develop AI further, or we could stop at some point, or we could stop where we are now.
We could definitely stop at some point. Like, if we're at the point where AI is useful, but it's not being used in the negative direction, and yeah, sure, then AI can, stay where it's at. But like, no, if it's, say, like, if it's taken like a step further and they really try to make AI like the number one thing that's going to replace everything, then that's not going to end up good. It's like that old concept that people had back in like the early 80s and 70s, like robots is going to take over everything, or the early 2000s is going to be futuristic, and we're going to have robot butlers or stuff like that. It clearly didn't happen. Here we are in 2025. We're still not there yet.
Have you seen the Tesla robots?
I've seen it. It's something. It's not what we expected, though. It's not like yet. The huge, futuristic technology improving, thing that's going to be revolutionary.
Yeah. But still, it's scary how close it is to that. They're literally humanoid at this point, the way that they're shaped and stuff.
Oh no, they're very close to it. But again, just like AI, it has many, many flaws.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, and so would you say like aiming for something that can do everything that humans can is a good idea or a bad idea? How do you see that?
It's a good idea to some extent. It would be nice to have assistance on, the little things in life, the things that we're able to get done, like with or without us. Like that's simple stuff. It's supposed to make the day easier or make our lives a little bit easier to handle, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. That would be nice. Like, a robot or some form of technology that will allow us to get our chores done automatically, and we can focus our time on work and other creations and projects, stuff like that. Like all the major things that's trying to make the world go around, that could easily be handled by some form of technology, as long as it's being used moderately and there's no downsides to it. But in terms of like the major like world running stuff, like, you know, the government and, you know, public transportation, all that major stuff, that could be handled by us. That doesn't require some you know, new technology or some form of thing to replace us. To what I'm trying to say is it's not required. It's
Right,
not
yeah.
necessary.
So we don't need to like get to sort of a general human level AI.
Nah, we do not.
And
Like everything should just stay the way that it's meant to be. The internet is not us, and we're not the internet. And you know, same case should be said for, you know, AI not being us and us not being AI, because that's not how it works.
I'm wondering. So if you would be like king of the world, you can do with like you can say what we do with AI. What would you say?
AI should be used in a creative and business friendly way. Let's say that. Like, it can't be used for copying videos, for helping you with schoolwork or stuff like that. It can't be used in that sort of thing. Like, something like that should be firewalled, or, you know, not be something that is accessible for the AI itself to be able to do for the person using it.
Okay, because that's kind of where we are right now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, so then would you roll it back?
Yeah, just roll it back.
Roll it back.
Let's keep it how it was like back in 2019, where the most funniest videos aren't made by AI, but, you know, we get funny videos like YouTube poops, where it's actually cleverly edited and stitched together instead of just being automatically done by yourself and being generated. Like,
Yeah.
it's not us, it's not human.
So back in 2019, it was like a bit human, and now we're kind of away from that.
Pretty
and
much.
It would like be nice to roll it back a little.
Somewhere between 2019 and 2021, we lost a brain cell or two and just started making some tomfuckery decisions.
Okay, well, great. Oh yeah, and also, I don't know if you're local, if you're from around here.
I'm all around here, yeah.
Okay, yeah, cool. We're having a protest, also with, also protesting. Did you hear about the whistleblower from OpenAI?
I have not.
Okay, so there was a whistleblower from OpenAI, and like the police ruled it, and he died by a gunshot, and the police ruled it a suicide. But then his parents came out and they said they looked at it and it wasn't a suicide, and now the investigation is reopened.
Right.
And so we're also protesting about that. Would you maybe like to come to the protest?
If I am not busy on any of those days, if I'm not working on a major project or working with Muni, then yes, definitely.
Sure. Okay. Cool.
Should be later in February.
Yeah, yeah,
I believe the last like week in February. It'll be around that time. If you
Last week in February.
do the RS or this QR code right here, it'll take you to our website. That has a page that has all of our events coming up. And this event will be fun too if you are free the Saturday, day before Super Bowl.
All right.
2 to 4. We'll have snacks, drinks. We'll just be hanging out in the park pretty much. We'll have footballs, maybe a soccer ball. You know, just hang out.
I'll definitely see what I can do then, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, man.
Okay.
Appreciate you stepping to talk with us for sure.
Of course. I had nothing better to do today anyway.
Nice. Okay. Thanks, man.
Of course.